Hi all, let's continue our look at the evolution of chess style with the focus currently on Mikhail Botvinnik. So in the absolute championship in Leningrad 1941, Botvinnik started to show his real strengths. He played Isaac Boleslavsky in this tournament, and here is a very interesting game against Isaac Boleslavsky playing with white. Boleslavsky, who had shared first the earlier year in the USSR Championship, the best achievement ever for that player, Boleslavsky. So we have here a French defense, and we go into the Tarrasch variation, knight d2. Botvinnik with white chooses the Tarrasch, and we have a very active continuation here from black, c5, so aiming for piece play rather than trying to close up the position. Black often accepts an isolated queen's pawn here, but actually after e takes d5, e takes d5 is played, not queen takes d5. So potentially there's the isolated queen's pawn. Now Botvinnik chose bishop b5 check and knight gf3, and here d takes c5, giving black the isolated queen's pawn. So what is instructive from a stylistic perspective about this game is Botvinnik's handling of the potential blockade squares, especially d4, and especially the dark squares in this position. How will white try and get a grip on the dark squares? Is there anything radically new or interesting from a style perspective, a cultural perspective, which could have laid the foundation for future examples of play? Let's see. White castled, knight ge7, knight b3, and it looks as though both knights are pointing at the key blockade square in the center. And here is a remarkable decision actually, which maybe does set this as a very interesting game example. Botvinnik actually chooses bishop e3, and he's accepting what seems to be quite a bad pawn and splitting his pawns into 3 pawn islands. So why is he doing this? Black maybe could have ignored this, but if white gets in, say black ignores this, rook e1, white's gone in this move for free and adding weight to d4 control, and this is slightly better for white. So black wanted to try and punish this move and played bishop takes e3. So we have f takes e3. It seems like quite a vulnerable pawn. So is this like a radical innovation in positional play? With this quite vulnerable looking pawn, of course black's dark square bishop is no longer bearing dynamic potential on this diagonal. Often f2 is a sensitive square in these sort of variations where black has the isolated queen's pawn. So white's kind of joined black in having an isolated pawn here in the center of the board, but white also has introduced an extra dynamic, this f-file pressure later. Let's see what happens. Black castled, queen d2, queen b6, still that diagonal is a bit sensitive, especially with the pawn there. a4, so this does provide the possibility, if this bishop moves back, of a5 later, or if the bishop supported, a5 might be useful. Bishop f5. This seems to be provoking white to use the tempo gaining knight fd4, not just blockading black's d-pawn but hitting the bishop. Black took, and now basically Botvinnik denies the pleasure of using the isolated queen's pawn here and fixes both pawn structures in a way. Less frontal pressure on black's pawn, and he's removed his own weakness, and basically the pawn now is just used for gripping these central squares, and white still maintains the dynamic pressure on the f-file. So it's a very interesting set of structural transitions that we've witnessed. Botvinnik at first joining black in having an isolated queen's pawn, then dissolving his own, but at the same time removing his own opportunity for frontal pressure on black's isolated queen's pawn, and not blockading with a piece. In exchange, he's got a good dark square grip. He's got the f-file pressure still. So let's see this in action. Knight c5 now, using the grip on the dark squares. Instead of moving the bishop, we have attacking black's piece instead. Black plays to defend that knight, and now white plays bishop d3. Bishop takes d3, queen takes d3. It's not particularly good to take on b2 here, I believe. It wasn't taken, it was ignored. If taking on b2, c3, and this is quite a pleasant position for white. Actually, the dynamic pressure is actually expressed here on the F file in a certain way. Say we give black knight g6 as a token move. Maybe a move like queen f3, and we're hitting d5. If black, say, doesn't move the knight and tries to do something about his queen, you know, because white's also potentially threatening here. Say something like this, then rook a1 actually is trapping the queen. Whoops. So that's no good. So what can black do? Queen b6, queen f3, and here knight e6 is now threatened, showing up some dynamic compensation. And it's tricky because queen takes d5 will happen if the knight moves. This is actually a tricky position. The rook can't move without dropping f7. So this shows that actually white's trump card of f-file pressure seems significant enough for this pawn sack to work actually. So it was ignored by Boleslavsky, perhaps rather wisely. And we have c3. So what has white got here? He's got a nice grip on the dark squares. This knight's actually difficult to evict because of a6. So it sits quite happily there on c5. And white's rooks seem active and aggressive. a5, as though b6 later now is more possible, but it does weaken the b5 square. Queen f3. And knight e6 is now threatened using the pin on the f7 pawn. Knight g6. Defending every point, it seems now, is defended because the queen's actually holding and the knight's holding e6 against knight e6. The queen's holding d5. So for the moment, doesn't seem too bad, but white now doubles rooks on the e file. So b6, knight d3, and now the pressure on the e file with the doubling of the rooks. Like a pair of bishops, a doubled rooks like this is superior to the opponent's rooks, and is something either a positional player or a dynamic aggressive player wants to achieve in chess, to double rooks to infiltrate, usually. Queen c6, g3, just strengthening the position a bit. Black's going nowhere. White possesses now that e file. You might think here, hold on a sec, isn't there queen takes a4? Let's just quickly examine this. I think, again, this is too dangerous now from a dynamic perspective to put the queen over here. A move like h4 with h5 on the cards is going to be really quite dangerous for kicking the knight to an awkward square now, and then knight f4 will probably win the d5 pawn. This is awkward for black. Say f6. Something like this is very, very awkward looking for black. Even if black tries to defend d5 now, his king side will be under great pressure here. An unpleasant position. Knight e6 again, and it starts to get really nasty. Like this, for example, with the e file and great attacking pressure. This is actually a winning position now for white. So nasty things happen if these pawns are taken in this game. You know, the dynamics will backfire on black. So let's see, rook d6 was played, trying to keep things secure. h4 now anyway. This is a very aggressive idea to dislodge this knight and hit, you know, black's d5 pawn. Although there's no frontal pressure, it's not protected by any other pawn, so it's a great target for trying to undermine, you know, kick this knight away from f4 to put a knight on f4 to hit this pawn harder. f6, queen f5. Now h5 is looking scary. Queen c8, trying to relieve the pressure for exchanges. That's taken, and h5. And now we have this infiltration. White is systematically increasing his positional advantage. Knight f4 putting pressure on d5. Now further exchanges, but still white persists in having a big positional edge. g5 trying to relieve the pressure. Without g5, well, maybe white just improves the king position and improves the knight, maybe centralizing the knight at some point, or just improving the king and maybe playing for c4 later. So black lashes out, takes, and we have further simplification. Is a rook on the 7th here enough to win the game against Boleslavsky? Well, black's rook is very passive. It hasn't got any entry points. It's just having to defend now, and the king is very restricted. That's the key point about rook on the 7th. White's king now can make progress, whilst black's king is condemned right now. The white king heads up the board. f4 is taken away here. Now king d3. This c4 break is still available for white, whilst black has no pawn breaks. With a prepared c4, it might create a passed pawn. Rook e6. But in fact, instead of like this with b3 and c4, now we also have this other break, b4. So white is trying to force through a passed pawn. That's taken. If it's not, then taking and then rook b5 will hit 2 pawns and win a pawn. So it's taken. Black is in lesser evil mode, trying to reduce, from bad choices, trying to make the best of it. a6 protecting the rook. b5, is black getting something here with this resource? Well, he's losing a pawn with it. Even though he's taking there, white is now officially a pawn up. We have rook c5 check. d5. Is this enough to win? Rook c4. Well, black didn't make things better with this next move, losing another pawn basically to king e2, or the end game is just totally lost. So here white will be taking on f5 if the rook moves. Here black resigned, but it was a difficult position anyway by this stage. So it seems here in this particular Botvinnik game, what was remarkable about it, as an example of how to play against the isolated queen's pawn, was kind of a very generous adding for white of an isolated pawn in the center, which then was used to sort of shield black's d5 pawn. But white still had a fundamentally better pawn structure, with black's d5 still being weak, and white had dynamic piece play, nice iron grip basically on the e file, and putting iron pressure on d5, putting increasing pressure on d5, trying to undermine black's knight, at the same time trying to get that f4 square, and later black trying this simplification, but white's advantage persisted into the rook and pawn ending. So it's a very, very interesting game example where bishop e3 is not like a top engine move or anything, and positionally it seems suspect. I think it looks like an odd game as an example, but maybe these sorts of games are very, very interesting ways of playing against particular pawn structures, and in this case the isolated queen's pawn. So I hope you got something from that. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.